So when I was a teenager, we lived in Blairgowrie, and that was in the 60s, and it must have been the fashion of the day to have grapevines in your garden. And I can remember several houses had built a sort of a trellis work over their driveway, and they'd grown grapes all over them, and they provided wonderful shade for the cars. But what was unusual about the area at the time is that there was a man called George, and George was Greek, and George owned the cafe up the road. Do you remember those days where all the Greeks owned the cafes and the Portuguese owned the vegetable shops? Well, there was George, and George was a wonderful man. But as far as George was concerned, every vine in the neighborhood belonged to him, because he would come every year when it was pruning season, and he would come with his ladder, and he would come with his clippers, and he would prune everybody's grapes. And heaven help the person who decided to prune them on their own. As far as he was concerned, they were his vines, he knew how to do it, and he was going to do it. And funny enough, when I started as a principal in my last school, we also had a George, but George came and pruned the roses. So George just appeared out of nowhere every year, and he had done for years apparently. And he would prune all the roses, and he'd get paid for his troubles, and apparently he did it across the whole neighborhood. So I had two Georges, one George pruning the grapes and one George pruning the roses. And of course one day George the rose pruner just didn't show up, so I suppose he retired. But we are busy at the moment with those I am statements. And actually between Wednesday and Sunday we've covered quite a few of them. So the first Wednesday we looked at I am the bread of life. Last Sunday we looked at I am the good shepherd, and we also spoke a little bit about I am the gate. Wednesday we didn't have a particular I am a statement, but sort of incorporated to it was I am the light of the world. And today we have the true vine. So let's read this. So John 15, the closing two verses, and I'm using a slightly different version to the version used before. If you abide in me, and the version we had from NIV simply says, if you remain in me. But most of the versions say, if you abide, and uses the word abide. But it's sort of the same thing, isn't it? So if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father, and this is the important word, my Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. So this word glory and glorified is something that we're going to hear quite a lot in John's Gospel in the second half of the Gospel. Because now we've reached a turning point. We've been dealing with up to chapter 12 before, and now we're 13 and beyond. And the end of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13 is a moment. If you read the closing verses of chapter 12, and we did just this on Wednesday, you would have seen that in many Bibles it's headed a summary of Jesus' teaching. And straight away we think, well, that's a bit peculiar. Normally you would have a summary at the end, wouldn't you? You wouldn't have a summary halfway in the book. But because of that part of the book closes. So up to then we called it the Book of Signs. From chapter 13 onwards, we're calling it the Book of Glory. And we're going to hear that word glory and glorification quite a lot. So, up until, just to put that end of chapter 13 in context, that is just after that entry into Jerusalem, and straight in chapter 13, it goes straight into the washing of the feet and the Last Supper and so on. So it changes dramatically. The other change is that in chapter 12, Jesus is talking to crowds of people. So even in the summary, he's talking to a crowd of people. But from chapter 13 onwards, he hones in on the disciples, and he doesn't speak to crowds anymore. He only speaks to the disciples, sometimes individually and sometimes as a group. So it's a very, very different theology. And Deus Christenberger, one of the wonderful theological writers, says this: the principal notion that Jesus rejects is that he came on his own initiative and authority for his own glory. Once again, invoking a common Jewish maxim, Jesus asks people to believe in him, not in his own right, but as the emissary of the Father. So Jesus isn't interested in glory for his own sake. He's only interested in glory in that the Father is glorified. And as you go see it, you would see that in John's Gospel, the ultimate glorification is the cross. Jesus giving his life for people and for the glory of God, certainly not for his own glory. So chapter 13 starts with a cleansing. It's a literal cleansing and a figurative cleansing. The literal cleansing is the washing of the feet. The spiritual cleansing is the betrayer. Judas the betrayer leaves the scene, leaves the disciples. So the disciples of Jesus are cleansed literally and figuratively. God the Father right away is being glorified, and as I say, the cross is the ultimate glorification. But on to today's reading. I am the true vine. So again, we've put it into context. This is happening just after the Last Supper. So what Jesus does then in John's Gospel, and it starts all the way in chapter 14, is he takes the disciples and he's walking all the way down the Kidron Valley, and eventually by morning he arrives in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we know what's going to happen in the Garden of Gethsemane. And what he's doing is he's talking to the disciples and he's giving them comfort, because he knows what's going to happen. He knows that he's going to be betrayed. He knows that he's going to end up giving his life. The disciples, of course, haven't a clue. They are really puzzled. I mean, look at Peter when Jesus wanted to wash his feet, how he stood up and said, what are you doing? This isn't the way things operate. So the poor disciples are totally puzzled. But Jesus is giving them comfort, giving them reassurance that he will be moving on, and where he is going, they cannot come. But there's going to be something in return, and we know that something is going to be the Holy Spirit. So this I am statement is part of that. So what does he say? Oh, before that, we've had the sixth of the I am statements. Part of it in chapter 14, it says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So in John 14, the Father's glory will be shown through the Son. And now in chapter 15, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. I am the vine, you are the branches. You who abide in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. So in all of these 7 I am statements, this is the only one where God the Father plays a starring role. God the Father comes in as the gardener, the vine grower, or the gardener. Now, there's great significance in the vineyard setting. And it sort of goes over our heads. We don't really see it, we just think it's a nice thing. But the people at the time would have seen the absolute relevance and significance of it being in a vineyard. And it goes all the way back to the Old Testament saying. There are many of them. I've chosen to use Isaiah 5. Isaiah 5 has a whole sort of poem. It's worth reading. It's quite long. Chapter 5 in Isaiah. It's called the Song of the Unfruitful Vineyard. I'm not going to read the whole thing. We'll be here all morning. But read it and remember that the people are not acting correctly. They're about to go into exile, and Isaiah is saying, you haven't done what you have will be taken away from you. So this is it. Let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones, and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it, and hewed out a vine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And later on, for the vineyard is the Lord of hosts, is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. So it goes on to say that Israel is God's vineyard, and we are the plantings, we are the vines, the branches in the vineyard. And God was expecting this abundant crop from the chosen people, from the people of promise. But instead, there was a bad crop. And Isaiah goes on with a warning that it will be taken away. So again from Kustenberger, the prophet, who is Isaiah, makes the point that God carefully cultivated his vineyard, which is Israel, and in due time expected to collect fruit from it. But Israel had yielded only bad fruit. Hence, God would replace Israel with a more fruitful nation. And later on, it is he, Jesus, who embodies God's true intentions for Israel. Jesus is the vine, the channel through whom God's blessings flow. That wonderful writer, I read him quite a lot, Kustenberger. So here we have Jesus as the vine in God's vineyard. The Father is the conscientious gardener. So he's not the sort of gardener that just, sort of isn't too interested, or perhaps looks at it every now and again. God is always at work in his wonderful vineyard. God is working for us all the time. So the Father tends the vineyard, prunes where necessary, so that the vine may produce good fruit. Now, we just had a holiday in Cape Town, and we spent a day up in Stellenbosch having a look at some of the wine farms, and we had an opportunity just to go for a short walk through one of the vineyards, and you can just see how they are looked after. And we are told that a vine pruner, it takes something like 2 to 4 years to train a person to be a really efficient pruner of vines. It's not something that you can just say, well, go and prune the vines. They have to be well trained to do it. Then he comes on, chapter 4, verse 4. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. So what does that mean? So we have the vine, the main stem, that's Jesus, and from the vine we have branches, and it's the branches that bear the fruit. Now the branch cannot survive separated from the vine. If the branch gets snapped, perhaps in a storm, or an animal walking past it, or somebody picks it off, if the branch is no longer abiding in the vine or attached to the vine, it's going to wither and die. That makes sense, doesn't it? So that is the same with us. Jesus is the vine, we are the branches. If we are not firmly attached to the vine, we will ultimately wither and die. And that word abide, we could probably speak about that word for another 20 minutes, but I won't subject you to that. But that word abide actually doesn't mean sort of pressed on. It doesn't mean just a little layer of glue. It really means intermingled, interconnected. It means really an intimate part of that vine. And that's what the message is, that just as the branch is woven into the vine, so we need to be woven into Jesus. So it can't be something that we just do when we feel like it. It can't be something that we worry about when we're in trouble. They say that, when do most people pray? Most people pray when they're in trouble. Rest of the time there's no need for prayer. This is saying that we need to be an intimate part of the vine. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I, then they bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch that withers and dies. And that's the message for us. We need to abide intimately with Jesus, as the branch abides intimately with the vine. The closing verse 8, my Father is glorified by this, and you bear much fruit and become my disciples. So we are glorifying God the Father, And I did want to talk a little bit more about glorification and glory today, but there isn't time. It'll have to wait for another week. So in this verse, in this reading, there are four things, four aspects. We have the vine, and the vine is Jesus. We have the branch is us. We have the gardener, and God the Father is the gardener. And we have the fruit, and the fruit is what we produce. So if we are well abided to the vine, we are going to produce good fruit. So let's look. We've already spoken about the vine and the branches. Let's look at the gardener. So God the Father is in control. God the Father is always at work. Pruning of the vine is a job for a specialist, a worker. We've spoken about that. And there are two types of pruning. There's one part where we cut away the dead wood so that disease is not brought into the vine. Cutting away what doesn't belong. Cutting away what should be destroyed. So we're either in or we're out. That's what the message is. Are we abiding in Jesus or are we not? If we're not, well then we are removed. And the second part is cutting away living tissue so that the growth is concentrated on the best part of the branch. Now, I'm not a gardener. We need my wife Alice to come and speak about this point. But any gardener, I think, will tell you that you sometimes need to prune the roses, the vines, whatever it is, so that what is remaining and that the very best of the branch, of the stem, of the flower can really accelerate. So it is concentrated on that particular part. So we recognize that in ourselves, the bad things that we do need to be discarded, and the good things that we are capable of doing must be directed so that we focus in on it. So it's no good really for us being absolutely good, but we're good in such a wide area that we're really just doing a little bit here and a little bit there, and a little bit there, and a little bit there. Far better to concentrate on what our gifts are, what our spirit is. And somewhere along the line, I think we're going to be talking about the fruits of the Spirit and the gifts that we have and how we concentrate on those gifts. And why do we do this? We do this so that we can serve others. Okay? Does the branch that produces the fruit, does the branch eat its own fruit? No. We eat the fruit. So the fruit that we produce, that's not for our own good. The fruit that we produce is for the good of others. So it's for the good of serving others. So that's what we're doing. We're abiding in Christ. We're part of the vine so that we produce good fruit to serve others. So let's wrap up. And isn't it amazing what we can actually get out of really a very short reading? And so we have this privilege and we have the responsibility to abide in Jesus. Why? So that we will produce good and plenty of fruit, not for ourselves, but in service to others. And if we do this, we are glorifying God the Father. Wow. Little old me and little old you, we are glorifying God through bearing this good fruit in service to others. You ever thought of that? That's what's worth thinking about today. We bear fruit to serve others, and in doing that, we are glorifying God.